It is estimated that at its peak, between 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Rome were slaves. Slavery was a widespread institution in ancient Rome, playing an essential role in the economy, politics, and society. Slaves were typically captured in war or born into slavery, and they could be bought and sold, owned, and treated like property. In this video, we'll explore the chronology of slavery in Rome and how the treatment and roles of slaves changed with time. We'll also discuss the views of prominent Romans on Roman slavery, the sources and treatments of these slaves, and the different jobs slaves would have, as well as how treatment varied. Chronology of slavery in Rome. Slavery in Rome began in the 8th century BCE, when Rome was a small city-state. At this time, slavery was not yet an essential part of the Roman economy, and most slaves were prisoners of war. However, as Rome grew in power and conquered other territories, the number of slaves increased. During the Republic period, 509 BCE to 27 BCE, slavery became an integral part of the Roman economy, with slaves being used for agriculture, mining, construction, and domestic work. The demand for slaves was so high that Rome even had a specialized market called the slaves' market, where slaves were bought and sold. During the Empire period, 27 BCE to 476 CE, slavery continued to be an essential part of Roman society. The number of slaves increased even more, and they were used for a wide range of tasks, from serving in households and working in mines to fighting as gladiators in the arena. However, there were also changes in the treatment and roles of slaves during this period, as we'll discuss later in the video. Treatment and roles of slaves. The treatment of slaves in Rome varied depending on the time period and the specific situation. In general, slaves were considered property and had no legal rights. They could be bought, sold, and punished by their owners. Slaves were often subject to harsh treatment, including physical abuse, long working hours, and poor living conditions. However, the treatment of slaves was not always the same throughout Rome's history. During the Republic period, slaves had more opportunities to gain their freedom, especially if they were skilled or educated. Slaves could buy their freedom from their owners or be granted it by the state. This led to the development of a class of freed slaves, who could become wealthy and influential members of society. It is difficult to determine the exact number of freed slaves in Rome during the Republic period. However, it is estimated that by the end of the Republic period, around 10 to 15% of the population of Rome were freed slaves or their descendants. Freed slaves in Rome were known as liberti, and they played a significant role in Roman society, particularly in the business and trade sectors. Some freed slaves were able to accumulate wealth and become successful entrepreneurs, while others remained in servitude to their former masters or struggled to make a living. During the Republic period, there were opportunities for slaves to gain their freedom, such as by serving in the military or through their masters granting them manumission, the act of freeing a slave. Manumission was a common practice in Rome, and it was often used as a way for masters to reward loyal and hard-working slaves or to gain social status. Freed slaves in Rome had a unique legal status. They were considered Roman citizens, but they were not granted all the same rights as those born free. For example, they were not allowed to hold political office or marry into certain aristocratic families. However, freed slaves were able to participate in some aspects of Roman society, such as attending public events and owning property. Overall, the number of freed slaves in Rome during the Republic period was significant, and they played an important role in shaping the social and economic landscape of the city. During the Empire period, the treatment of slaves became harsher, and the opportunities for freedom decreased. Slaves were often subjected to brutal punishments, including crucifixion and being thrown to wild animals in the arena. However, some slaves still managed to gain their freedom and become respected members of society. Views of prominent Romans. Not all Romans agreed on the institution of slavery. Some, like the philosopher Seneca, believed that slavery was morally wrong and advocated for the humane treatment of slaves. Others, like the statesman Cato the Elder, believed that slaves were necessary for the Roman economy and should be treated as property. The Roman poet Ovid wrote about the injustice of slavery in his work Tristia, where he compared slaves to animals and argued that they deserved to be treated with compassion and dignity. The statesman and philosopher Cicero also criticized the harsh treatment of slaves, arguing that it was not in the best interest of slave owners to mistreat their slaves. Sources and treatment of slaves. Slaves in Rome came from a variety of sources. Many were captured in war, while others were born into slavery. Some slaves were also purchased from slave traders who specialized in the trade. Slaves were often sold in markets, and their prices varied depending on their age, gender, and skills. The treatment of slaves in Rome varied depending on their specific roles. Domestic slaves, such as cooks, maids, and nannies, were often treated better than slaves who worked in mines or on farms. This was because domestic slaves were seen as an extension of the family and were often given better living conditions and food. However, not all domestic slaves were treated well, particularly female slaves. Slaves who worked in mines or on farms were often subject to harsh conditions. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions, and their owners often did not provide them with adequate food or clothing. Many slaves died from disease, malnutrition, or overwork. Different jobs slaves would have. Slaves in Rome performed a wide range of tasks, from household chores to heavy manual labor. Some common jobs for slaves included domestic slaves, cooks, maids, nannies, tutors, and personal assistants. Artisans, weavers, potters, metalworkers, and other skilled craftsmen. Agricultural workers, farm laborers who worked in fields and vineyards. Miners, slaves who worked in mines, often in dangerous conditions. Gladiators, slaves who fought in the arena as gladiators. Conclusion. Slavery was an integral part of Roman society, playing a significant role in the economy and politics. The treatment and roles of slaves changed over time, with some slaves having more opportunities for freedom and better treatment during the Republic period. However, during the Empire period, the treatment of slaves became harsher, and the opportunities for freedom decreased. Not all Romans agreed on the institution of slavery, with some advocating for the humane treatment of slaves and others believing that slaves were necessary for the economy.